Welcome to the Silicon Fox podcast, where we explore the habits and stories of high performers. I'm your host, Mitchell Eschner. Well, Alyssa, thank you so much for hopping on the Silicon Fox podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I always like to start these by just giving you a chance to give us a quick background as to who you are, where you came from, and what you're working on today.
Very fun. I take that question literally. I'm from Canada.
Please. There you go.
Which is probably not the intended point, but yeah, I'm from Canada originally, grew up in Toronto, and moved to San Francisco about 4 years ago. And I joke that my journey to healthcare was like a highly personal one. I moved from what I call a highly functional sort of like free healthcare system to one where you like pay and can't access it and don't know what to do. So as a user of it, I sort of like moved to San Francisco and was like, what's happening? Why can't I go see my primary care doctor or like my OBGYN properly? Um, and in sort of a generalist investing role, it like quickly propelled me into being very interested in healthcare. And so I'm an early stage investor at Bain Capital Ventures. I primarily invest in pre-seed through Series A companies and lead a big part of our healthcare practice and have invested in companies like Stillna Health, Charta, Tandem, on the sort of administrative software side of healthcare, and then companies like Loyal Health on the longevity side, Pasture Bio, which is a cow vaccine business. So sort of like admin software to like funky therapeutics and
love it.
everything
I
in
love it.
between.
I love it. What's the biggest? I mean, this is maybe not the first time I've heard it, but one of the few times I've heard it as to. Well, I mean, we all know American healthcare is relatively dysfunctional, but what's the biggest delta you see that you saw in Canadian healthcare versus American, and like what would it take for us to get to where they're at, and just give us like maybe even like a 2-second primer as to what Canadian healthcare structure is.
Yeah, I mean, I argue with colleagues a lot about this because there's sort of like two extreme statements people say. One is like you die waiting, and the other is like you die not being able to afford healthcare. And that's sort of like the definition of the two sides. And like a sort of like free or government paid system, it should be more equal access, but what that means is you tend to have longer wait times, it's more difficult to access care. Um, but when you access it, you have sort of like a universal health card and you don't have to pay for anything. And so it sort of like relieves the burden or friction of like getting care because there's not this sort of like looming potential debt on the other side of it. On the sort of like American healthcare system, as I've experienced it personally, and I think is like well studied, it's like, access is like pretty good if you can afford it, and it's pretty bad if you can't. And there's sort of like this wealth driven experience to healthcare.
Yeah.
And so and some of this I think we'll talk about today, but like I'm a huge believer in sort of equality in, basic needs, and I believe healthcare is one of those. And so I think that's why I personally probably over glamorize the Canadian system. But
Yeah.
so when I grew up with, it worked for me. I think there's a lot we can learn in the US from it.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think there's a lot of downfalls. Like we're not sort of a large innovator in Canada around like new healthcare technologies, new therapeutics, et cetera. And so sort of being profit centric comes with its benefits on the innovation curve. And so I think that's why you see a lot more technology and innovation come out of the US around healthcare as well.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to me how like we're kind of the hub of innovation, and yeah, I mean like the standard statement obviously is like and I'm sure we'll dive deeper in, but like we're so unhealthy in this country, but yet we're the hub of innovation, like the main sales. I'm curious, like if that's the case, like is this some kind of circular economy, circular revenue type of things we're seeing with AI? Has that been happening in healthcare for long periods of time? Because we've had like a lot of innovation, and yeah, is it like democratization of access that's like the problem, or kind of kicking us off here? Like, what is this large issue that we're seeing as to why we have so much innovation, excitement, but not nearly the same kind of outcomes that we see in other places?
Yeah, I mean, I want to like answer that specific question, then zoom out a bit, but I think the specific answer is like profit pools are centralized around administrative friction. And so if you're a founder thinking about an opportunity to go solve, you're looking for where the money is. And the money is in all of these sort of like, it takes me, a lot of manpower and a lot of effort to get a prior authorization done. So like, let me go solve that problem. And I think we are changing access and like that is helping sort of the cause, but the sort of like there's like a payer response to that. And as at the end of the day, like I'm not sure how much we're sort of like driving things forward. I think that's changing slightly as we see more AI clinical capabilities and ways to really like expand the volume of health we can provide. Um,
Yeah.
I think that personally is like for me one of the biggest needle movers. But I think there's like a bunch of reasons why it hasn't moved forward. I think one is like regulatory, which is you can't deliver care with AI today in the US legally. The FDA has been pretty clear about this. And they've been pretty clear in that they don't know how they're going to regulate it, but there will be regulation. And today, there's really like no clear path forward. If you think about like mental health, for example, there's a lot of great tools today, but none of them are sort of legalized. And so
Mm.
we need that sort of like framework for how we regulate these things to move quickly so that people can actually build towards a better future in that way. Um, and then the other two things for me is like, if you think about where AI has like been transformational in just society, it's never been, with the exception of like Waymo and sort of autonomous driving, it's never really been like life or death use cases. And so, you're not going to kill anyone if you generate an image poorly. You will kill
Yeah.
someone if you misdiagnose them.
Right.
And so I think the perceived risk of these things makes it, and I don't think that's a bad thing, but it makes it harder to see innovation in this area. And we talked about this a little bit, but sort of like this like misaligned incentives component, which is, if my favorite example, and I hate to sort of riff on the PBMs, but like PBMs were meant to sort of like negotiate drug prices on our behalf. They've really turned into like, how do we get the, most expensive, high cost drugs because, we make more money as a middleman. And so how do we sort of like change the, various players in healthcare such that it's actually benefiting and like lowering costs as opposed to like going to like the most profitable dollar. And that's been, I think, the third biggest issue.
Yeah, I mean, interesting. That makes sense. Like on the risk, perceived risk. I guess there is like in defense, we are seeing though things come out that are being actually implemented, and that's in the same capacity. And maybe that's because there's maybe more of like an urgent need to some extent. Um,
Well, I
but
think
I'd
in
be
that case
curious as
also like the regulator is the buyer. And in this
right.
case, it's slightly different. So I
Mm.
think you can move a bit faster in a way that in healthcare, I think it's a bit more difficult. Yeah.
What do you think? I guess this is a kind of tangent, but what do you think about these latest programs that just launched? I don't know if you heard about Access or Tempo. I don't know. Have you seen them? Like this kind of answers this. I mean, it's a small initial start, but does it start to answer these questions?
Totally. I mean, there's that. There's some of these new CMS codes that are like enabling some admin care with technology. I was just seeing like that. I was on the FDA um, session, I think earlier in November, where they were talking about like, yeah, we don't have like a specific way to regulate, AI tools, but we're like moving towards it. And here's sort of like a few ways to sort of think about it. And I think there's a lot of good stuff coming. I think access is like, it's unclear how it will,
Yeah,
um,
yeah, it's new. I mean, it happened 2 weeks ago. Like
yeah.
Tempo was announced like a week and a half ago.
And like Guide, I think is like a good program in the right direction as well on the value-based care side, but like it's like a 2027 start.
Right.
So anyway, I think there's a lot of like, hey, we're doing this program. It's not clear how it'll work, but we're sort of like saying that we're gonna like spend real dollars to invest in new policy. So I think it's a move in the right direction. My point is like, I think with all healthcare, it's like the devil's in the details.
Yeah.
And it's also where sort of like the economics come to light. And I yet haven't seen sort of like real economic data behind some of this yet.
One of the things that you said that's kind of interesting to me, and I want to understand how you think about deeper, is this trade-off between like the workflow automation side of healthcare and the like therapeutics, AI, AI native computational biology or whatever else it is that we're seeing. What was the claim, just like to make sure I know, watch what you said, that there's a lot more innovation in the workflow automation because there's more dollars there? Or what was the statement before I asked my question?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. It's like there's
Yeah.
so much um, human capital spent in administrative burden that if you
Yeah.
can, it's that plus it's a great application of AI. If you think about AI as like taking unstructured data, manipulating it, transforming it, doing some analysis, and then output, a lot of that work I think follows like that rough shape. And so I think that's where you've seen a lot of sort of like building over the last 5 years. Because it's
Is
like, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, like, is that where more capital is flowing? I guess that's my biggest question is like, if that's true, that's kind of an interesting and a pretty big observation. Because I feel like just anecdotally, we've seen a lot of capital, especially recent, flow into like yeah, AI native pharma and drug discovery and whatever else. And like I guess the difficulty from like a capital allocation perspective, and again, curious as to how you guys think about this, is like, well, it's a moonshot bet, revenue or like a workflow automation makes sense. It's going to move the needle. It's going to free up budget. It's going to lead to better outcomes versus betting on something much more technical. It's like, I mean, if you look at the state of healthcare today and the state of innovation today, where there's such delta that it probably makes much more sense from a feasibility perspective to implement, automation workflow rather than, hey, here's like an AI native diagnostic. But how do you guys think about that? Because is there not more dollars flowing into the diagnostic now in the past like few years?
Well, I think it depends on how you think about like software versus like human labor. So if
Yeah.
you think about like administrative
Oh,
costs in
fine.
the healthcare
Got it.
system, it's something like 25 to 30% of total costs. Care delivery is like 50%. Um, and so if you think about it in that lens and not just like how much are we spending on tooling, I think it's equivalent to, if not larger than most other parts of healthcare. I
Got it.
think that's why you're seeing so much interest. The other thing on sort of like workflow is like it's more predictable to see how you build a big business. In diagnostics and in therapeutics, with the exception of a few, they're pretty centralized on like specific, use cases, specialties, indications. Um, and so the sort of like total applicable population tends to be smaller. And sure, like for some oncology drugs, you can charge a ton of money, but I think the sort of like hit rate is different. And I think for us, like as software investors, we view healthcare as really like a massive vertical for software application versus I think we have a life sciences fund at Bain Capital. It's a really different muscle to invest in sort of like life sciences and therapeutics.
Yeah, it makes sense. I guess I was asking the question more from like a capital invested perspective rather than from the budget. So that makes sense. Because I was gonna say like if we read headlines, not that's the best way to like pull data analysis. The headlines seem like there's so much capital flowing into discovery, diagnostics, life sciences, especially because they are so capital intensive. But if you mean from a budget perspective, that makes full sense. So I guess there is like that beast to tackle. How do you guys think about that from like an opportunity perspective? I mean, as investors in this space and being bullish on like what's going to both have a net positive return financially, in the healthcare system, et cetera, they're typically aligned. How do you underwrite these kinds of investments in the era of AI? Like there's a lot of low hanging fruit for workflow automation, but the low hanging fruit implies a lot of competition, implies like, hey, it's been around for 5, 6 years. We've known this problem for such a long time. Why now? Sure, and AI has enabled some of it. How do you think through that?
Yeah, I mean, as I think about like, I want to start on like, there's so many different categories, but administrative software where we've spent, I think, a lot of calories investing. Um, to me, there's like a few important things. You can build a lot of tools that relieve some admin burden, but to me, this sort of alignment with real revenue uplift is crucial on the provider side. So, like two investments that I've made, one, Silna Health, which is like a prior auth automation company. We work with a few specialties, but let's use one as an example, autism care providers. These folks have to get authorizations every 6 months for their patients. And if they fail to get an authorization, they won't be paid on that visit. So yes, there's like humans who are doing the work, but there's a real revenue impact of the work that they do. Charta Health, a business I work with that reviews charts with AI to find, coding anomalies, mistakes, audit and compliance, as well as like upcoding. A lot of folks on the provider side, miscode the acuity level of a visit as one example. And so if you can tell a provider, hey, like you coded this as low acuity, but really it's mid acuity, providers tend to be, more conservative generally on that front. And we have the data to back it up because, now we have scribes everywhere and we have the full transcript of the visit and we have the whole dialogue. That's like 10, 20, 30% of visit revenue. And so to me, that's really important. There's a lot of things you can do to solve admin, but there's not a lot of things you can do that and really drive a revenue impact for the business. And you can think of that as like almost unlimited. It's like if you free up like 100% of their capacity, they can do like 2x as much work. Um, and so to me, that's like a really important hallmark of the stuff that we invest in. And I think the other thing is like, yes, like AI has like really changed how we think about workflow automation, but I think there's like things that are like better versus worse suited for AI. And to me, it's like healthcare is interesting because there's like integration defensibility, there's like custom workflow defensibility that, in other areas of AI you don't see. And so for healthcare, it's like, it's really hard to integrate into Epic or Cerner or Athena. And the team that's able to do that quickly and build proprietary relationships tends to win. Or custom workflows are really important. It's not like we're investors in a business called Decagon and customer support, and I'd say
Yeah.
customer support is like a more well mapped workflow. Like companies have documentation around this. In healthcare, it's like there's three people in a back office that do this thing. They've done it for 20 years. It's not documented. And so for a lot of my companies, it's like you fly to the site and you like literally shadow the person doing the work and you learn about how they do it. And how they do it is different than the provider down the street. And so I think that's like a really different thing about healthcare that doesn't exist in a lot of other verticals, but is also like a way that you build real differentiation. And so I look for founders who are like really masterful around some of those things that build defensibility in their business. And then I think the last thing is like, how do you think about how sort of like latent the demand is for this? Again, there's like a lot of things you can do that solve sort of small problems, but like when I talk to providers about prior auths, they're like screaming and shouting. They're like it's grown 5x from 10 years ago, the volume of them, and we can't handle sort of like appeals and denials. And so when you hear that, I think it like really makes you believe like this needs to be a solved problem versus, some other applications that, I've seen.
What's interesting in healthcare, and I'm curious as to how this gets solved, and maybe you have some early theories. Um, there's kind of an I guess this is every single emerging business when a new technologies comes to disrupt, but there's kind of ecosystems that start to get built. And you brought up a great point was like AI Scribe, we now talk much more casually about it. But even like anecdotally, a lot of organizations, like there's just still slow adoption, despite the fact that there's been large businesses that have been built, whether a bridge, Ambience, et cetera, and Epic putting out their own, all the big names have now, come here. But like if you actually talk on the ground, it's kind of split, like who's implemented, who's not. And then even then, how does one build an ecosystem here? I guess like why Epic succeeded, and this is like probably one of the fun cool takeaways from the Acquired podcast on this, was like they kind of built this full-blown ecosystem because there are so many components that have to plug and play. And in its own sense, like you'll kind of end up rebuilding, or at least it'll be much more efficient system, but you'll end up rebuilding a layer that requires all this integration work and all this human capital, or maybe find agent capital, whatever we want to call it, to go like do integration work and then constantly reintegrate when you go to a new vendor and all the other things. And so like early days, how do you think about like these ecosystems being built? Like do people build a full vertical integrated system and then it's kind of problematic because it's really hard to sell, or they try to plug and play, but then they're going to be competed against 5 different vendors. It's not even part of like, to build a system that's reliant on scribes today seems a bit, early and scary because it's not integrated everywhere. So now we're talking like it's constant consolidation towards the top. And even to cite one of your earlier points in like health equity, that's obviously a problem because it won't be getting implemented to these places. It'll be implemented at the Mayos and the Cleveland Clinics of the world. How do you think about that ecosystem play? Because I think to healthcare, it's really quite specific and difficult.
Yeah, it's an interesting point you bring up on scribes. I'd say at Bain Capital, we own a number of provider groups across sizes, including hospital systems to like, small SMB clinics. Um, I'd say 2 years ago it was true. Like, people were exploring scribes and weren't sure if they wanted to implement it and which one they would choose. I'd say our entire portfolio on the provider side has adopted a form of a scribe. So I think
And
it
they
is becoming
use
ubiquitous.
them.
Yeah.
Would you say they active use? Okay, wow, so interesting.
And I'd say the like level of questions I get now are not, 2 years ago was like, what scribe should we adopt? And now it's like, hey, like the scribes have really worked and we've built trust in technology. How should we think about intake using AI and like actually using it not in a clinical encounter, but in a patient facing capacity for scheduling and intake and these sorts of use cases. And so I've been impressed by how we've like elevated the kinds of things we have comfort around. That being said, we're talking about private equity backed provider groups. So maybe not the perfect reflection of like American
Yeah.
providers broadly. But I've been impressed. I just wanted to call that out. And then I'd say that, yeah, I'm with you. Like, I was just reading this article this morning about like the death of the system of record. We had like four systems of record before, and then it sort of exploded into like, if you have some data silo and some proprietary data on your platform, you can build a system of record, and that's sort of turned into like we have thousands now, and I think that's definitely happened in healthcare. We have people who are claiming they have like the patient system of record on like intake, and other people who are
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
I'm the scribe, and so I have the visit. Other people are like, I'm going to build the system of record from like the RCM side and like build like from claims data. And that's we're just talking about providers. There's like a ton others on like the payer side and pharma and et cetera, and patients and employers. And I agree with you. I think there's just too much of the sort of like I sit on this data silo and I'm going to expand, and then that's going to sort of like compete and expand with someone else's data silo. Um, and I think part of what we need is like better data connectivity across platforms. Like, why is Epic so hard to integrate with? And why is it that they choose like two partners in each area and those are the only technologies that are provided? As one example.
Yeah.
I'm also highly biased because we own Athena Health, and I'd say Athena is like one of the most open ecosystems. They partner widely with all technologies. They're all available on their marketplace. If you're a provider, it's sort of like open connectivity, but also open data access between folks in their marketplace and their EMR. And I'd love for us to get to a point where that's the case. It's like let providers make the best sort of tool decisions for them and let their system of records, which I personally believe will continue to be the EMR, but let them be sort of an open data trove where they can connect tools they need and give them access when they need them. And I think that really hasn't happened, albeit with the exception of like a few EMRs like Athena, who are I think much more forward thinking.
Are you a health coach or running a health course and looking to level up your client's experience? With Cyphox Health at-home blood test, you can deliver lab-quality blood work right to your client's door. Seamlessly ship samples back for fast and actionable results. Personalize every consult with the data that matters. Clients who complete a Cyphox test are 60% more likely to enroll in a paid program after their consult compared to those who only join a sales call. If you're ready to give your clients the edge, go to cyphoxhealth.com/partner. And as a Silicon Fox podcast listener, enjoy 10% off your first bulk order.
One of the things you said was this kind of like integration is one, which is interesting because like, yeah, opening that is one thing, but if you do open up all these integrations and you constantly have to evaluate vendors, one of the things you brought up was kind of proprietary relationships, if that's like the right way to talk about it. Um, and so like if that becomes the moat, I guess in healthcare, what's interesting and at the same time scary is like if the reality of this AI wave from both a healthcare perspective and investing perspective is that because integrations are hard and because it once you're in, you're kind of in, which maybe is going to be fluid in the years to come. It's a lot more of a first movers game, it would feel, than like a merit based. I know like in Scribe, there's a lot of stories now of like the top Scribe companies are all demoing to the same, platform, and now you have like a true competition. But when it's something net new and like this is the first or second time you've heard about it, these people have built a good relationship, you're in, somebody comes in 6 months later, builds something much more efficient. How do you think about that, like from even a defensibility perspective in portfolio companies, from an underwriting perspective when you invest? Like, is proprietary relationship something that will sustain because it's healthcare or because it's like agnostic across industries and that's just like enterprise SaaS? It works.
Yeah, I mean, I want to sort of like be careful around like EMR is the only sort of like difficult relationship or barrier to growth. But I think scribes are a great example, right? Like a bridge has this sort of infamous Epic relationship, and I wrote an article about how sort of the EMRs are building scribes now and like what's going to happen next. But it suited them really well. Were they first? No. There I remember years before that, we met a business called DeepScribe. And there were a bunch more in that era. Um, Abridge wasn't first. I think they had a really interesting product and thesis that it could be fully autonomous versus, having humans in the loop. Um, and they had a founder who was a provider himself, who sort of like spoke the language of the user and really built trust quickly with partners like Epic, but also with like large provider groups and systems. And I use this example to say I think it's a combination of access, being early but not first, but early with the right product and then team. Um, and I look for those three things, particularly in healthcare, because one, I think relationships are really important, and relationships don't have to be just EMR, but it can be important channel partners. It can be, another example is we talked about that sort of like implementation and custom workflow piece, like building real trust with your customers to be able to go fly out and like mimic their workflows, embed yourself in a health system, and like that's how a lot of best in class healthcare companies found their ideas. They just like went to Mayo or something like that and said like, hey, I want to like shadow your providers and find opportunities. Like it's really hard to get that done. And so that's another example. And then I mean, we're very founder centric at Bain. I think it's like the right and only way to do early stage investing. And so in healthcare, it doesn't have to be healthcare experience. It can be, really great technology experience paired with, working in regulated environments broadly. It can be, really deeply understanding a part of healthcare that you're building in, knowing all the right, providers and counterparties, et cetera. But it's like, what about this founder sort of like gives them the right to win? And I think a lot about that when I make investments.
So do you think access is like one of these first key pillars? And I guess how is access defined? Like you kind of briefly touched on it, but what does that mean? And do you think there's value in, there's probably a lot of industries and a lot of examples of people that have been net new to an industry and then they've been great because it's a set of fresh eyes and optimism that may last you the way of the difficult journey rather than the initial pessimism. How do you think through like access first founders in healthcare specifically?
I think it depends on the use case. I work with the team at Tandem, for example. That's a medication adherence platform. But they work with pharma companies, patients, employers, sort of like threading the needle between a lot of different counterparties. And, that founder came from Oscar Health. He sort of like grew up in healthcare. And I think those relationships have really benefited him as he scaled this sort of like very complicated relationship-based business. Um, However, like you go back to some of the earlier companies we were talking about on sort of like pure admin capabilities. Maybe you're only selling to providers. That looks more like, you're selling to an SMB or mid-market audience. There's like a few relationships you have to manage, like an EMR integration. But beyond that, I think it doesn't look that different than building in legal tech or building in trucking or logistics. And I think in those areas, you can benefit from having someone who's more of an outsider. I'd say broadly speaking, in healthcare, I found that distribution can often be the more powerful tool than product.
Yeah.
There's sort of like a product baseline, and then it's like who can distribute that baseline product better. Um, and
But
if you think
distribution
about the
would be
buyer and
like,
the audience, yeah.
no, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, if you think about like the buyer and the audience, um, they're not the most technological folks. They're not the most
Yeah.
savvy, and so I don't think they're looking for sort of like best in class, sort of like forward leaning solutions. I think they're thinking about things that just like work in the context of their day to day life.
When you see distribution outside of reimbursement, what else is there? Like is it beyond there's like relationship side of the spectrum and then unlocking reimbursement codes. Is there something else to distribution that's in healthcare, some kind of hack or initial touch point that's super important?
I mean, even on the code side, I think it's not as simple as just having CMS relationships. But a lot of this is like lobbying. A lot of I write this like Substack on regulatory shifts. But if you think about like the early days of the EMR, like that was a federally mandated adoption of technology that really benefited like the vendors that existed at that time. If you think about a lot of the drugs that are passed, I was just at one of the government summits around the FDA. And like a lot of this is like, are you talking to the right folks at the FDA and presenting your data in the right way? And do you have the right relationships? I think each of these things are very relationship based in healthcare relative to most other areas. Um, Athena is like an example. Yes, it's an open marketplace, but like you need to know the right folks at Athena to be able to get access to get listed on their marketplace. And you probably have to work with two or three Athena providers before you actually, get listed. And how do you expedite that? Well, folks inside who can sort of help you with that. And that's the same across EMRs. And so I think there's sort of like examples of this at every sort of corner.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's important to note that like I think this is a pretty debated or split topic. So knowing that beforehand is obviously valuable. I
Yeah.
want to kind of zoom out here and think really basic and fundamentals. If you had to pick a few things to tackle first in the healthcare stack, what would you rip out? What would you change? Like really granular examples of what you think is most flawed in modern day American health infrastructure.
It sort of goes back to like the very first thing we were talking about, around sort of like where are the biggest failure points. Um, there's sort of like a policy level question, which is like I would rip out how we think about technology and policy. Um,
What
we
would you
need to
change?
balance. I mean, we have to balance life or death, and these things obviously have like a real human and clinical impact. But one thing I would change is like, how do we have more experimental sandboxes? There's one in Utah, for example. That's not healthcare specific, but they enable like the testing of AI technology earlier than it would otherwise be allowed in this country. How do we make that the case in every state? And how do we allow people, and in this case patients, to like self-elect into testing with new technology in a way that's like legal and monitored? A lot of healthcare being approved is having clinical data to support the approval of it. And if we're going to sort of like delay the ability for people to get clinical data and test their products with real humans, we're not really benefiting or moving technology forward. So my first thing is like, how do we bring that sort of like Utah sandbox for AI across the country and allow testing? And so how do we then, use that data in testing to actually bring to light like the best in class tools that are actually improving care, improving outcomes, improving access. And I think that sort of data is really important. And then sort of like broad tailwind that I think a lot about in this country as it pertains to healthcare is like we're talking about like strain on the system today. But think about in 20 to 30 years, this sort of like silver tsunami or aging epidemic that people talk about all the time. We're going to double the amount of people over 65 in this country. We have like the highest healthcare costs per capita. Um, and so that's like a problem statement. I think part of the solution is like how do we drive better outcomes through better care coordination? And I wrote a whole post about this on my blog, but like there's these new codes, principal illness navigation and community health initiatives, and there's a few others that came out last year, like APCM, that are all geared towards like people with multiple chronic diseases, people with a principal illness. Like, how do we get them not care, but how do we get them to the care and like everything in between the cracks that are currently the reason that they're ending up in an ED instead of in the urgent care or at their PCP? And so I think about like that sort of like support mechanism as something that we've like utterly failed at in this country, and I think is a big part of like why a ton of the costs are driving into like high cost environments instead of like go to your PCP, do better triage, get the solution you need, stay out of the ED. And so
Yeah, that,
that's sort of like a big thing I think about.
Yeah, I mean, that's super fair. I mean, that's a big one. I might have read that post, so I think I know what you're talking about. Um, but one thing that I'm actually kind of really curious about, and often all the time I find myself not understanding the answer here, is when you evaluate, and I would actually even maybe answer this question in like a few different hats, like as an investor or as a policymaker, because I think it may differ. Um, but what do you underwrite in terms of step function changes and improvements of processes? So the first thing you said here was like basically faster time to tech adoption, better sandboxes, and better, faster improvements. So one argument made is like in the short term, well, maybe that means like, yeah, opted in, letting patients opt in, a lot more RPM work and letting that data be democratized and open source and all this kind of stuff, letting people plug and play with it in some healthy and safe way. But then there's like this argument of like there's so much going on in this like really deeply technical world. Maybe it's too far away of like digital twins and being able to do like maybe fully remote clinical trials that actually get validated and have true, substance behind what they do. When we think through this type of industry or this problem statement, are you more excited about and are you more bullish on these maybe shorter term fixes that are more feasible, and like shorter term could even mean 20 years? I don't mean like two. Um, or should we immediately go to like what is the absolute and most altruistic and fastest and most efficient scenario that is technically feasible today, but it is a moonshot? Like, how do you trade off those two things? Because I guess one could be the killer of the other, but the other could come in 25 years, and it's a bit hard to understand. Like, what would one bet on? Because I think about this a lot. I think there's a lot of examples of this in healthcare, specifically on like patient care side.
This is a horrible answer, but I think we need to bet on both. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think there's been a world in which people have said we bet on the right horse because we made three investments and they all worked out. Like, we bet on both, moonshot ideas. Like, take Loyal as one example. Dog longevity is sort of a starting point for thinking about human longevity long term. Um, and then more tactical tools that are like adopted today and are changing lives today, like a prior authorization getting approved impacts someone's access to care. Both of those things can be true, and like both of them can be in service of like a healthier American population. One is far more moonshot than the other. I think both we have to invest in all of these things. I, and so it's sort of a cop out answer, but I also think about investing in both as like an important part of like portfolio building. Um, because to your point, like there is risk. That's a bad example of those two, but like there's risk that some of these like moonshot ideas of like reimagining access, like one crazy idea I think about is like, should we strip primary care out of insurance? Like that sort of changes a lot of these like tools for primary care. Like if that sort of like is outside of the sort of payer system. And the reason I believe that is because if you think about insurance, insurance is for catastrophic events. Like theoretically, primary care should be something that you access regularly as preventative. You have a relationship with your primary care doctor. Like, why on earth is that sort of like an insurance paid for product? And so if that's the case, like, sure, like there are a bunch of tools on the primary care side that like might not be needed, but you could
Mm.
invest in like the future of cash paid direct primary care or employer paid primary care and bet on some of those moonshot ideas. And I'd say like I'm in favor of doing both.
But on the policy side, I guess this gets a bit tough because, like, as a policymaker, if I start thinking through, like, where does this country sit? I guess in theory, I can fund both through, like, maybe SBIR and IH does the more short term and like DARPA does the long term, or however you think through that today. But it gets like kind of hard to evaluate, is it worth pouring so much money and time? Because like as a venture firm, you move much faster than a policymaker, which is why I think it's useful to understand it from like both sides of the spectrum, because you also, to some extent, are obviously betting on that policy aligns with this vision. So you kind of want to know is like, hey, we believe we'll bet on both, but if the policymakers decide, you know what, let's go for the moonshot because if we bet on it, it'll accelerate the time double and we'll suffer the next 3 months, but then, or 3 years, but then year four, we're going to achieve something here that's going to be massive. Now, I don't think there's been a case of this actually happening in history, but assume that, I mean, I think there's a lot of new and fun stuff happening in the healthcare world with these programs that we just talked about. Like, how do you think about that trade-off or valuation? Do you consider it? Do you care about it? Or is it a lot more just like first principles? I think we're going to bet on both. It's good for portfolio management and there's value in both existing and they can always, hyperfit to each other in the long run.
I mean, my experience on policy, and I've written about a few of these codes, is like even if there are sort of more out there codes, they rarely risk the existing system. They usually live in tandem. And so, at least from a policy perspective, I found that the sort of approval of new codes doesn't mean, I mean, here's one example. So APCM used to be like this like set of chronic care management codes that used to be like hourly for people coming out of the hospital, getting discharged, et cetera. And they changed that to like a per member per month kind of reimbursement. It's not sort of like ludicrous, crazy out there, but like I think it's a good example,
Yeah.
which is like it kind of changed the way if you were investing in chronic care and thought that like you could make $100 an hour and like you could do like 10 hours a month, and now suddenly it's like $110 per patient per month. So like it really collapsed the economics and reimbursement. Um, yes, like if you made an investment betting on some like chronic care marketplace business, like it's probably not, incredible. But there's still like a reimbursement framework, and I think the push of that policy is like, how do we really enable technology to deliver a lot of this instead of like having people do it, which is why you choose like a per action or a per member per month instead of like a per hour. And so yes, I think like it ends up crushing some of the like existing services, but I think it's important to have bets on both sides because you have no idea which of these codes will impact which things and where things will shake out. And I think my personal experience has been like it's hard to tell where policy is going, particularly in this country where every 4 years policymakers change. Um,
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
so, there were a ton of things as part of like the Biden administration that never really took place after Trump was elected. And so I find it to be like important to balance and weigh, as you described, a portfolio. And I think it's important to have like a point of view on where policy might go. I think it's hard to have a crystal ball on these things.
Yeah, I guess it's super fair to, from a capital allocator perspective, to look at both. But like the counter argument to be made is like a lot of what we're talking about here today is like efficiencies and optimization. Having both exist when one clearly is like a small subset of the other, and the other is always what's going to get defaulted to, and it's a newer and better. It would imply that like hopefully we get to a scenario where policymakers realize this. And the difficulty is like when you run such a big country, it's difficult because like yeah, well, still someone in some organization is prescribing this code and billing to this code, and thus you can't just eliminate it. But as we get more and more efficient over time, the hope, I guess, would be that if we create a net new code for the reason to eliminate others, those others don't exist. And like I mean, yeah, again, I don't know, I can't cite too much history here, but if that were the case, I guess that we'd live in a more efficient society where it would just be more centralized. So like information wouldn't be nearly as siloed, and there wouldn't be so many codes, and we wouldn't need to like constantly be misbilling and all these other things.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, I just putting my venture hat back on. I think the most important thing we do is like back on founders who are dynamic and adjust to these changes. Like, you run a healthcare company, and if something were to dramatically change, in something that was around like reimbursement or policy around what you run, you'd probably be pretty like dynamic and responsive to that, and figure out ways to like change your business model. And I think that's why being founder centric is so important, especially in this industry where things change. Um, and policy has such a big impact on how you make money relative to a lot of other spaces. So it's a big thing I look for.
Yeah, that's super fair. I guess I kind of ignored the founder centric part, thinking more of like, hey, you know, a firm has a thesis and it's like, oh, well, here's a big problem in healthcare, and someone went to go out save it, and you're like, oh, okay, well, we found the company in the space, and now this is where it would cause this chain effect of problems. Um, you talked a little bit about like problems in healthcare, and you talked a lot about AI and its involvement. What has been outside of like workflow automation, because obviously that's a clear use case, but what have been like breakthroughs in AI that you've been excited about that have gotten implemented in healthcare or actively slowly getting implemented that are kind of net new and novel, but you're seeing adopted at a faster rate? I guess my example here, you just taught me something new today with Describe. um, like I think it makes sense, but just like some rural random hospitals that are, you know, that have much smaller populations. My experience is incredibly anecdotal and small, so by no means making a claim here. But they were like, oh, you know, we signed with NABLA, I think it was, but we have not actually implemented it because physicians are negligent to actually like start using this. We paid for it, but we haven't started it. Um, what are those other kinds of AI examples? But on the flip side, where like you're actually seeing adoption, and why do you think that is?
Yeah. Just going back to that like Utah AI sandbox, what I like to look at as like an
Yeah, what
area
is that, by the
where
way? I might have missed.
um
What is?
yeah, so Utah, the state at the state level passed a sandbox where AI tools can be tested in sort of like a different regulatory framework than the rest of the country. And it's more permissive basically to allow people, in this case for healthcare patients, to, utilize new technology. Um,
Without FDA approval?
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Oh wow, that's huge.
Um, And so there's these sort of like medical triage tools that are being tested in Utah today. Um, you can think about it as like you go to ChatGPT for a bunch of medical queries today, or at least I do, and like what's like a better, more trained version of that actually on like real medical data, like supervised by physicians. I think that's really
Open
interesting, and it goes. Sorry, go ahead.
open evidence? Where were you? Open evidence is kind of that, no?
I guess open evidence, but for patients instead of doctors.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, that's fair.
and I it goes back to my like direct primary care comment about like how do we strip away sort of like triage and primary care from the healthcare system. But I think that's like a really important part of that, which is like how do we allow people to like triage themselves and give them the medical data they need so that they know like is this emergent or non-emergent? Do I need to see a provider today or can I wait till tomorrow? Do I need to go to the ER? Like what's the right kind of point of care? Um, and routing is like, I think one of the biggest problems, like routing and access is one of the biggest problems in the system. And so I'm really excited about some of the work coming out of those sandboxes. And hopefully like they build enough patient data to be able to like go to the FDA and say, look, like it's safe, it's tested, like let us roll this out across the country. And there's versions of that that are like, hey, like we're using an AI tool, but we're having a provider like read every output. That's like another way to go about this, where it's like within the confines of how the FDA thinks about like AI tooling, because the provider is still reviewing it. But I'd love to get to a point where that's not the case because, ChatGPT passed the medical bar. And so
Yeah,
clearly
yeah.
there's like some evidence around it being sort of like useful and accurate. So that's like what I'm really excited about, that I'm seeing today.
Yeah, this is an interesting point because one of the conversations we had with an organization was like, hey, we built this great thing for RPM and it's incredibly useful and it can save X amount of dollars, save lives, very value-based care kind of approach. But something as granular as it needs to send data to a phone to send to the hospital and these small things, but half these patients live below the poverty line and just like they don't have that infrastructure. And it's like, how's that going to work? And so this kind of interesting point is like in the world where an AI can look at all results of like a remote system or a preventative and proactive system, that's great. But without that, how do you think about that? Because I think one of the things you just brought up was like having somebody interpret their own results, whether it's, colors or noises or beeps, and CGMs do this to an extent. But this is like, in my mind, and maybe I'm being too pessimistic on the space, but kind of scary. I think it's not nearly as sophisticated as like what, Function Health giving you all of your blood labs and sure interpreting it for you, but now it's like you're the CEO of your own health, and maybe this is a bit tough to comprehend. There's obviously a delta here, and this is kind of feeds into my macro take on being the CEO of your own health. That like having too much data, or even just some data on yourself, like it's nice to be able to be educated on your decisions, but I don't know if this is as altruistic and as positive as we think. Like, if we really gave people all their access to their data today, I mean, look at the state of the world today, right? Like, GLP-1s were such a massive success because people didn't, I mean, not to hate on GLP-1s, but people just didn't want to go work out, right? So, like, if I give them all their health data today, are they really going to be proactive and take the right steps? Are they going to be able to interpret it? Even if we build great UX to help them interpret, are they really going to do that? So, my next question was, like, if we do collect this data and we build a system, I think this alludes to one of the examples you brought up in this Utah sandbox. We build a system that allows people to get noises or be put in different phases of like risk and so forth to take action, and they're the ones taking action. Is that really a positive world that we think will exist and will work? There are like examples of this working with CGMs and beeping and this kind of thing. Because the flip side is like, well, if they're not the ones looking at the data, and we are not in a world where we trust the AI to look at the data, we now have like a whole new stream of data for physicians who are already overworked and overwhelmed to say, well, now you're going to monitor this person, and we're going to, like, the AI is going to notify you anytime there may be risk. And that may be often, it may have false positives, it may have 10 million different problems. And the physician has a whole new job. And there's so many, like, you're going to obviously do this to a lot of people because once this is now a net new thing and available, there's a lot of positives and a lot of patient populations that should be using it. How do you think through that? And is that a world we end up in? And
Yeah.
how do we fix that?
I mean, first of all, there's already so many RPM tools, and I talk to providers who are, stuck interpreting this data, and it's already like a big bottleneck. And so I only view technology as like a benefiter of that, which is like you don't have to diagnose the data, but you can summarize it and analyze it. And I think those are like kind of different things. But I think to your main question, I view this as like there are levels to how people want to interact with our healthcare system. And you could say I don't care about having all these best in class consumer technologies, and I don't care about tracking my health. What I want is just a chatbot where if I have severe stomach pain, I can describe my symptoms, sort of like a WebMD, and it will accurately triage me and say, based on exactly what you've described, do these set of tests to yourself, and if these things are true, go to this or that. There's from that to like the extreme level of like, let's get a DEXA scan and let's like have all of my reads from all of my devices, from my Whoop and my Aura and my Garmin, um, and I have a CGM on, and I'm testing all of like these new hormones, and I use function, and XYZ. And I want to be like really in like the sort of, as you described, like CEO or driver of my own healthcare journey. And I think we can have a range of tools that work for all of those audiences, and all of those would be better than what we have today. And so I
That's
don't
super fair.
I don't think about it as like, if we give everyone all the data, like what are they going to do with it? And like people are really lazy. I think about it as like, let's create a set of tools that address the full population and people can interact how they want. And all of those tools would be better than what we have today, which is like wait 3 weeks to show up to your PCP, and then wait 6 months to go to your specialist, and then wait 6 months for a scan. And so that's sort of the world I imagine. And I think that should be offered through a physician, because I think what you said is really important. Like AI should not be the only deliverer of care. I think it's just good with like high volume, lower risk triaging. And then that should be paired with a physician that actually supports care, analyzes critical results, et cetera. But how do we like enable that physician to see more patients, see them in a more proactive way and build a real relationship? Well, we need, better front end tools to be able to do that. And so that's how I think about like that continuum. And then there will always be like in every society, like junkies who are like extra data driven and want to like be longevitists, as I call them. And
Yeah.
like we'll build tools for them. But those will mostly be cash pay and like, like that's like sort of self subscribing.
Where do you think physicians sit in the stack? Because I think a lot of this then opens up kind of a new paradigm of net new data, lots of interpretation, like really new belief on how to um, identify and kind of consult a patient in a really different manner now that they have so many new things to look at and so many different new ways to assess and really understand. I mean, what would this like how would an efficient system be rebuilt here? This is like one of the constant themes I hear on the podcast that we talk we've talked to a lot of CEOs of large value-based care companies, and fundamentally they're like, look, as the CEO of a value-based care company who wants value-based care to work, our biggest fault in value-based care, it's not taught from like the start of the stack all the way from like unit economics to medical school to all these like really foundational things. And so that's a bit of a problem. So the same thing here is like, what is this larger outcome of a sand? I mean, I'm super bullish on the sandbox. I think this is great. But like, what is this larger outcome if these technologies get adopted, good businesses get built, but then we kind of still end up in a world where lots of people signed, lots of people saw the clear outcome here, but the actual implementation and the actual physical change from frontline workers and physicians and others isn't there, because that just seems to happen a lot in healthcare. I'm trying to understand how you think about reversing that or actually penetrating that.
Totally. And I'll use an example outside of healthcare, but I think it's really relevant. I work with this team called Magic School, which is the fastest growing AI tool in education. And they serve, kindergarten to grade 12 schools, and they allow teachers to teach their students with AI at like the grade 3, grade 4, grade 5 level. That's when they begin. These kids are like typing a prompt and like generating an image, like something that you and I never had in primary school. um, that's what it's going to take in every field of endeavor for people to change the way that they work with AI. And I think, especially to your point, like in medical school, in university or college, medical sciences, undergraduate degrees, like how do we allow people to like learn with the tools that they're going to be using one day that we believe are really going to like drive change? And it starts from like the educational level. There's a bunch of stuff you have to do downstream of that, but it's like if we believe that AI triage is like an important thing that will happen, and AI enabled reading of large scale data from like RPM devices, how do we allow medical students to like use that in their first year and get comfortable with those tools so that when they go into the workforce, like that's our whole belief at Magic School, for example, and I think that's true of every vertical. um, I think the other thing is like incentives. And the incentives drive behavior. And so, how do we incentivize physicians to want to learn about these tools? You have to incentivize them with dollars. And so, thinking about like the right structure and policy there. And then the third thing I believe a lot in is like we use physician as this like person who does everything in healthcare. Um, and I actually think like what is required is not just like AI and physician, but it's like AI and then like levels of physician. And we're seeing this with like the sort of surge of NPs and PAs, in addition to just like RNs and doctors. But like, how do we sort of like task base our medical system to say like there are actually like 6 or 8 levels of care that is needed to be provided? Some of it can be done by non-clinical personnel. Some of it can be done by RNs, PAs, NPs, physicians. And how do we actually allow physicians to treat, the highest complexity and most important, most difficult cases? And how do we actually distribute care across the system in the most efficient way? I think we're getting there. I'm so glad that there's all of these different types of schooling and these sort of certifications that have come out, but I think we need more of that. And I think it needs to be more distinct. Something AI is really good at is routing, like analyzing something that's coming in and understanding where it needs to go. And so I think what we need on the other end is like a set of like types of people that we've decided are like sort of like the right things to route to in the best ways.
So do you think it's like a top down? You start with the implementation of the actual tech. Once you realize that, hey, this is clearly valuable, but it's not being implemented enough and being used enough, now we need to get this as part of the education system. Or do you think like, is like what has to come first, right? In some capacity, we can have theories, but unless they're implemented, we don't know how truly feasible they are. But once we implement them and we know that they're feasible and useful, we now kind of have to like play this game and dance for the next however many years to say, okay, well, it's useful, but it's not going to get mass implemented until we incorporate it into adoption. And there's a massive time and feedback loop there. And have you seen anybody doing this that's like succeeding here or trying to tackle this problem that you're excited about?
I keep going back to scribes because I think they're one of the first technologies that have been like broadly adopted that have really like
Yeah.
changed um, AI and healthcare. But to your question, like one policy, I think like you can't do things that are illegal in our system, and so policy has to change to enable a lot of this stuff to work. But after that, one thing that really made scribes work actually was top down. They went to like large systems, and they didn't go to providers. They went to managers of these systems, CIOs, CTOs, and said, we have data. We've tested this, that it'll make your physicians 30% more efficient. It'll reduce their burnout. They spend 2 hours a day note taking. And we'll actually impact your bottom line through this technology. And a lot of providers like 3 years ago were like, no way I'm using a scribe. And it was really top down. And then, when a few early lighthouse systems, which is always the case in healthcare technology, folks like Mayo, Kaiser, John Hopkins are always like early adopters. Their providers are forced, so to speak, to try this technology. They're like, whoa, it works. They tell their peers. And then slowly it starts to sort of disseminate in the system. And there's openness to adopt. And then it becomes sort of like bottoms up. Like I think a year after these sort of like enterprise scribes took off, we saw a bunch of these like bottoms up, $100 a month. You're a psychiatrist, you're a mental health provider,
Yeah.
like you can buy a scribe, and it was like flying off the shelves. But it wouldn't have happened if there weren't this sort of like early 1,000 provider test groups at these systems who were forced to use it even though they weren't sure if it would work because there was a real business case presented to like a business buyer to try these things out. And so that's like generally a flow that I think we've seen work, and one that I expect to work in the future.
Yeah, that's super fair. And have you seen, and I can't say I've interacted with this, and I'm curious if you've seen like true pushback from more legacy healthcare institutions. Like maybe there's not a lot of people that are actively adopting, and maybe there is now a lot of people that are actively adopting, and there's just like few that are not. But is there active pushback? Like outside of policymakers, have you seen healthcare institutions that say like, no, this is not negative, in the off chance that this causes more harm? We're just like super against this period, and how's that macro played out
You mean on scribing or broadly?
broadly?
I think they're like that on most things. Like they're really hard
Yeah.
to convince.
But like really adamant against, not just like to be convinced, like, yeah, whatever, someone else uses it, cool, don't sell to me, but just adamantly against, like, hey, let me tell all my other healthcare institution friends that this shouldn't be implemented, and whether or not they listen is a different question. But have you seen any of that? I'm just curious because like if I'm a healthcare institution and there is like a life or death scenario, often um well, the reason it's so slow, and I'm just like even us talking about some of the frontier AI stuff that we've talked about in sandboxes, it just feels like we are far from it on the actual like mass implementation side. I think there's a lot of cool things going on in Mayo and a lot of cool things going on in these clinics. But if you again you go to like a hospital in a town that's far from a large city, and it's just really really far from a lot of this stuff, and like whether the hardware, the software, the the actual operations and workflow automation component of it, it's so far from it that I'm just curious, is it because like, yeah, is it a capital question? Is it a geography question? Is it because there's really active pushback across platforms that are not deeply incentivized to try net new things, and there's the fear of this net new thing not working even if the data is there? Like, what's the reason for us not having mass? I mean, it kind of boils down to back to my first question when we started this chat, but deeper to like the people that are against it. Have you seen that, and why, and what are they doing?
Yeah, I mean, to me, the issue is like lack of data. Um, like most of these buyers are pretty logical people, and pretty data-driven people. Like if you think about a physician prescribing medication, they look at clinical trial data, and they look across phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and all of the comorbidities and risks and toxicity. And they say, look, based on this data and based on what's been presented to me, I feel comfortable prescribing this medication. We don't have that with like a lot of these tools, because there
Yeah.
has been no way to do it. And I feel like I'm sort of like harping on the same horse again, but like it's been a huge lack of like an ability to do testing and trialing of these tools to be able to get to a point where you have a data to show to a physician or a buyer and say like, hey, we've tested this across 10,000 American adults across demographics and geographies and et cetera, and we know it's safe definitively. Like, and there's not a lot of tools that can say that today. Um,
Yeah.
and so to me, that's like the biggest blocker. And then it goes back to some of like the policy conversations that we've been having. And then I think the other thing that you call out, which is really important, is unfortunately, because we're talking about life or death, if there's examples of, negative outcomes, that's a huge trust defeater. And so I think that's where a lot of like healthcare technology goes to die. Why we have to be really, really careful um, about, how we implement, when we implement guardrails, et cetera. But on the other hand, I sort of struggle with like, if you look at mental health technology, the alternative is like people are using generic chatbots and having healthcare-like conversations with them and building emotional relationships. And there's really negative outcomes that have happened. There's been suicides that are documented. And so then you start to weigh like, is it better that we have a tool that's like, not perfectly tested, but is tested more and trained better than a generic tool? How do we weigh those two things? And so I sort of see those things on both ends. It's like the alternative is that people are getting access today through non-medical means. Um, and how do we sort of get them to like a better capability? But then at the same time, like how do we build the better capabilities if we don't have a way to like actually get data to test them? It feels like a little bit of a catch-22. And so ultimately, I think policy
Yeah.
will be like a huge driver of this.
Yeah, that's fair. And I guess it's the hardest part to get someone to recognize something is like in a frame of reference of relativity and saying like, hey, maybe we've had issues, but it's relative to what you're doing today. It's much better. But unless someone sees a massive step function change, I think like with scribes, the reason this is such a good case study and example, it was a step function change to say like, hey, it's not a copilot or this or that. It's like really replacing this process and a clear like toggle rather than like, hey, this is 7% better for your patients. Like, no, this is a really meaningful double digit number, percent time back to physicians. Thus, it's just like it's kind of a no-brainer and it's much more of a go-to-market game versus some of these
Yeah.
technologies. Like 7% is meaningful if that can avoid certain massive outcomes, but maybe it's not meaningful enough for someone to say, hey, I'm going to change my practices here.
I think scribes are such a tough example to point to though, because unfortunately they're not life or death and it's not clinical. And so I think about that a
Yeah,
lot is like,
that's
is
fair.
that success indicative of future success? Or is that just indicative of like administrative software success in healthcare?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, but I guess
and
there's a lot of room for software, like
yeah,
administrative software success to happen.
totally.
What are good, like uh, you've probably analyzed a lot of this stuff more than me. Like what are have there been good successes that you've been excited about on the non-administrative side, but on the clinical side?
At least on the AI front, not really. I think we're really early. Um, so nothing that I think the most exciting stuff has been more consumer paid to date.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I always find it hard, at least in the American system, to think about like whether that will actually translate to payer paid because the payer funded system is just like 10x larger, 100x larger than consumer paid. And so I find like spend on like function or superpower not really indicative of like what will happen in like the broader system. But I think it's like good signal that 1% or 0.1% of our population cares enough about this stuff to pay $500 to get tested and get more
Yeah.
data.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the sell that's been kind of interesting to me for a lot of these consumer-faced orgs is employer paid, and having that process go through like less of a consumer basis, but via employers, and that seems to be
Yeah.
kind of like a growing thing. I don't know if that's of interest, but it's interesting.
I think the employer-led model has always seemed really attractive outside in, but the reality is like engagement is the only thing that matters to employers. They're not going to pay PMPM for something that like 5% of people use. Um,
Yeah,
and engagement tends to be really low
but then
across. Yeah.
but then that like that actually proves the case study that engagement is low in the past, but if it works in the consumer model, I guess it doesn't work across the masses, so maybe it proves your point.
Yeah,
But
I think it's like
um,
0.1% spending an extraordinary amount of money. And if you try to do it employer led, like just think about the distribution of like employee populations, like most of them don't lie in the 0.1%. And so you end up
mm,
having poor engagement, even though like the tool seems to be doing well because like a small amount of people are paying a ton of money for it. And it sort of through line to like our GLP conversation, which I think part of it is just like people want a shortcut to good outcomes. And a lot of the things we're talking about are like high effort in some ways.
yeah. Yeah, but like what so then what is the solve there? Just like on that topic briefly, like is it just gamification and making like health really fun and like incentivizing somehow, you know, not only does the employer cover your lab, but they also somehow incentivize you to get it. I mean, I feel like people do that, right? Though, like they pay for the lab plus, like, hey, you get $50 to do it. And is engagement still bad there? I honestly I have no clue. I haven't seen any
Yeah,
data
some
on
of the
this.
gamification stuff has worked. There's like some rules around like you can't pay the employee to like go
Yeah.
see a doctor, but you can like give them a gift card. And some of that stuff
Okay.
works. There's this one business I really like called Garner Health, that
Yeah.
basically like covers your deductible.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are financially motivated. So if your employer is like, hey, like you have basically zero out-of-pocket healthcare costs, go to the doctor as much as you want and you have real healthcare needs, you're probably going to the doctor more than if you had to pay $3,000 in your deductible. I mean, for me, it's like a big reason why I don't go to the doctor. I'm like, I don't want to pay $500 out of pocket before I hit my deductible.
Yeah.
So I think financial tools are really effective. Um, so it has to be financial. And it also has to have like real outcomes. And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
feel like, getting a blood test doesn't really impact me and I'm not getting paid to do it and it's a lot of work. So like, I don't really want to do it and I'm scared of needles. So like, all of those
Yeah.
equal, like I'm not going to engage. And so how do you
Yeah.
find things that are like low lift, financially motivated, and like aligned with like actually improving outcomes?
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's a good point. Get them non-invasive blood tests.
Yeah.
What's it called? Um, Kind of to wrap up here, and we've talked a lot about like future forecasts and whatnot. But boiling it down to one or two things, what are you most excited about in the next 3 to 5 years that'll come out in this innovation loop? And it seems like, a lot of these different programs, maybe it's an outcome of these programs or a company or an idea in healthcare that you think will actually not just succeed in theory, but actually will get applied and we'll see the outcomes of it.
Yeah. I mean, the two buckets to me, I'm spending a lot of time reading, writing, and investing behind is one, like elder care solutions. And the sort of like PIN and CHI and some of these codes is like a hallmark for what's to come, which is like care coordination support for a system that will be like one quarter people over 65 in 20 years. And so to me, there's a ton to be built there. I'm really excited about that. Um, and then to me, the second, and we just spent the last 30 minutes talking about it, is sort of like direct primary care, better triage, better AI at like the first touch point with the healthcare system as like a way to improve access and impact. And I'm
Oh,
really excited about some of the use cases in Utah and otherwise. And like, I expect like in 2 to 3 years, those things I hope will become ubiquitous and hopefully will be employer distributed as a way to get better distribution quickly. But I think will be really important to empowering our physicians to do a lot more.
yeah, I mean, super fair. I think that's kind of an exciting future to be in if it can pan out, obviously. Well, Alyssa, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for hopping on the Silicon Fox podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was super fun.